What's the price of disrespecting the wrong judge? For Tyler Anderson, it was worth every penny of his father's supposed millions to find out. After all, when you're 17 and your Instagram bio reads, Miami's golden boy, why should you bow to anyone? Stand up, Judge Richardson's voice cut through the whispers. I said, stand up, Mr. Anderson. The courtroom fell silent as 50 pairs of eyes turned to the teenager slouched in his chair, one hand casually scrolling through his phone. At 17, Tyler Anderson wore arrogance like his Gucci loafers, effortlessly and without apology. His eyes barely flickered toward the distinguished 55-year-old judge, a woman who'd spent 3 decades fighting her way to the bench, only to be dismissed by a boy young enough to be her grandson. Make me, Tyler's voice dripped with contempt. My father's worth $50 million. He can buy this whole courthouse if he wants to. Judge Richardson's smile made the room freeze. There was something in that smile that made even the court reporter stop typing. Interesting, the judge said. Sometimes the most expensive lesson in life is free. And Tyler Anderson's education was about to begin. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe if you believe pride comes before a fall, but humility leads to healing. Tyler Anderson was 17 years old and had never heard the word no. As the self-proclaimed Prince of Coral Gables, he moved through life with the kind of arrogance that only comes from believing money can solve any problem. At Coral Gables Preparatory Academy, his reputation preceded him. Teachers looked the other way when he skipped classes. Students parted like the Red Sea when he walked down hallways. 3 times he'd been caught vandalizing school property. Twice he'd assaulted security guards who dared to challenge him, and each time the complaints mysteriously vanished. My father's money makes problems disappear, he'd boast, adjusting his gold watch with practiced indifference. But on a warm Thursday night in Miami, Tyler Anderson finally went too far. Behind the wheel of his new Porsche 911, he turned Ocean Drive into his personal racetrack. Witnesses would later describe the horror of seeing tables and chairs flying as the sports car swerved through the crowded street at 120 miles per hour. Dozens of people dove for safety as the white Porsche careened past Miami's most popular night spots, missing pedestrians by inches. This time was different. This time, there were too many witnesses, too many victims who'd nearly lost their lives to a teenager's reckless display of privilege. And most importantly, this time the case landed on the desk of Judge Sarah Richardson. Known throughout Miami-Dade County as the Equalizer, Judge Richardson had spent 3 decades ensuring that justice wasn't a commodity to be bought and sold. She'd sent the mayor's nephew to juvenile detention, ordered a senator's daughter to serve at homeless shelters, and never once wavered in her belief that actions should have consequences, regardless of the family name attached to them. As she reviewed Tyler's file, thick with incidents that had mysteriously disappeared, her expression hardened. Bring him to court, she ordered, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. It's time this young man learned that some things can't be bought. Tyler's response to the court summons was predictably dismissive. Another joke of a hearing, he told his friends, straightening his designer tie in the mirror. I'll be out in time for lunch. He had no idea he was about to meet the one person in Miami his father's supposed wealth couldn't impress. Courtroom 714 buzzed with anticipation that Monday morning. The usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations died as Tyler Anderson strolled in, 10 minutes late, as if he were entering a country club rather than a court of law. All rise for the Honorable Judge Sarah Richardson. The command rang through the courtroom. Everyone stood, court officers, attorneys, spectators, everyone except Tyler Anderson, who continued examining his manicured nails with theatrical boredom. Mr. Anderson, Judge Richardson's voice carried decades of authority. In this courtroom, we show respect by standing. Tyler's eyes lifted slowly, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm comfortable where I am, thanks. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even the court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard. Young man, Judge Richardson's tone could have frozen Miami Bay. I said stand, and I said no. Tyler leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. My father makes more in a day than you make in a year, Your Honor. He said the title like it was a joke. If anything, you should be standing for me? Do you know who my father is? Judge Richardson removed her glasses slowly, deliberately. The room grew so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fan creaking above. Actually, Mr. Anderson, she said, her lips curving into a knowing smile, I know exactly who your father is. You see, before this session, I took the liberty of doing a thorough background check on your family. Would you like to know what I found? For the first time, Tyler's smirk faltered slightly. In fact, she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom, I probably know more about your father's financial situation than you do. Shall we discuss it here in open court? Or would you prefer to stand now? Tyler's confidence wavered, but his arrogance won out. You're bluffing, my father. Mr. James Anderson, Judge Richardson called out, her eyes never leaving Tyler's face. Would you please join us? The heavy courtroom doors creaked open. Tyler turned, ready to witness his father's grand entrance, and felt his world tilt sideways. There stood James Anderson, not in his usual expensive suit, but in the navy blue uniform of Richardson Global corporate staff, complete with a name tag that read James Anderson, Maintenance Supervisor. Your Honor, James said quietly, his voice heavy with shame, I apologize for my son's behavior. The blood drained from Tyler's face as Judge Richardson continued, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Anderson has worked for my husband's company for the past decade. He's one of our most dedicated employees, working multiple shifts to provide for his son. She paused, letting the truth sink in. Though I believe this is the first time he's learned what his father actually does for a living. Tyler's perfectly crafted world crumbled around him. The designer clothes he wore, the car he drove, the life he'd bragged about, all built on a foundation of his father's overtime shifts and multiple credit cards. Now then, Mr. Anderson, Judge Richardson's voice cut through his shock, would you like to stand for the court? Or shall we discuss how your father really spends his days? For the first time in his life, Tyler Anderson stood without argument, his legs shaking beneath him. But this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of his education. The silence in courtroom 714 was deafening. Tyler Anderson, the boy who'd never been denied anything, stared at his father's worn uniform with uncomprehending eyes. The gold watch on his wrist, his prized possession, suddenly felt like it was burning his skin. Dad? His voice cracked, sounding for the first time like the child he really was. I don't understand. James Anderson stepped forward, his work boots echoing on the marble floor. Gone was the mysterious businessman Tyler had imagined attended high-power meetings. Instead, here stood a man with calloused hands and tired eyes who smelled of cleaning supplies rather than expensive cologne. Your Honor, James's voice trembled. May I speak? Judge Richardson nodded, her stern expression softening slightly. Tyler, James turned to his son. Every morning for the past 10 years, I've left our house at 4 a.m. You thought I was going to board meetings, but I was cleaning offices. That Porsche you crashed, 3 credit cards maxed out. Your designer clothes, I took night shifts at a warehouse. I did everything I could to give you the life your mother and I dreamed of before she left. Stop lying. Tyler shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and shame. All those business trips, the offshore accounts, were stories. James interrupted quietly. Stories I told because I couldn't bear to see you feel as abandoned as you did the day your mother left. But I was wrong, son. I was so wrong. From the gallery, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes. She remembered the day her own husband had worked 3 jobs to put their kids through college. This wasn't just about a spoiled teen anymore. This was about a father's misguided love. A story as old as time. Judge Richardson cleared her throat, but before she could speak, Tyler did something that shocked the courtroom even more than his earlier defiance. He began to laugh. The silence in courtroom 714 was shattered by Tyler's laughter, a hollow, desperate sound that fooled no one. Very funny, he managed between forced chuckles. Nice performance, Dad. You can stop now. Judge Richardson's gavel cracked like thunder, silencing his laughter instantly. Mr. Anderson, her voice had shifted to steel, you seem to think this is some kind of game. Let me be crystal clear about your situation. She lifted a thick file from her bench. In my hands, I hold the credit card statements your father tried to hide. 3 jobs, Mr. Anderson. Night shifts, weekend work, all to maintain your illusion of wealth. She turned a page deliberately. I also have the incident reports from every entitled escapade you've managed to slip away from. The security guard you pushed downstairs for asking to see your student ID, the teacher's car you vandalized for giving you a C minus. Tyler's smirk had completely vanished now. The judge continued, each word precise and cutting. In my 30 years on this bench, I've seen every kind of privilege, every kind of arrogance. But you, young man, have managed to distinguish yourself. Not only did you endanger lives with your reckless driving, but you've spent years tormenting a father who sacrificed everything for you. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into him. So here's what's going to happen now. You will stand when I tell you to stand. You will speak when I tell you to speak. And you will listen, really listen, to every word your father has to say, because your days of calling the shots are over. The judge paused, letting her words sink in. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to spend the next 6 months in juvenile detention. I'm sure they have lovely designer jumpsuits. Tyler slowly rose to his feet, his legs shaking beneath his expensive trousers. For the first time in his life, he faced someone money couldn't impress and lies couldn't fool. Now then, Judge Richardson's voice softened just slightly. Shall we begin again, Mr. Anderson? All his life, Tyler Anderson had practiced the art of appearing untouchable. But now, standing in courtroom 714 with his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, he looked every bit the 17-year-old boy he was. Your Honor, James Anderson stepped forward again, his voice stronger now. May I show my son something? Judge Richardson nodded, her expression softening slightly. Proceed, Mr. Anderson. James reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a folded photograph, creased and faded with age. Tyler, look at this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This was taken the day your mother left. You were 2 years old. Tyler's hands trembled as he took the photo. In it, a toddler version of himself sat on the steps of a small apartment building, tears streaming down his face. You cried for weeks, James continued, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. Every night, you'd ask where Mommy went. Every morning, you'd run to her side of the bed, hoping she'd come back. He paused, swallowing hard. I made a promise that day. I promised you'd never feel that kind of pain again, that you'd never feel less than anyone else. Judge Richardson leaned forward, her stern demeanor temporarily replaced by genuine concern. The courtroom sat in rapt attention as 15 years of secrets began to unravel. So I worked, James's voice cracked. Maintenance shifts at Richardson Global from 4 a.m. to noon, warehouse work from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., weekend jobs whenever I could get them. Every time you asked for something, every expensive toy, every designer label, I just couldn't bear to disappoint you. Tyler stared at the photograph, his carefully maintained facade cracking. The business trips, he whispered. Extra shifts in our other facilities. Those fancy hotel photos I sent you? Downloaded from the internet. James wiped his eyes. The offshore accounts? There aren't any, son. It's just me trying to be the father I thought you needed. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Tyler Anderson looked truly lost. The gold watch on his wrist, a 16th birthday business trip gift, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Judge Richardson watched this exchange with experienced eyes, seeing not just a spoiled teen and his deceiving father, but something deeper, two broken people who'd lost their way trying to heal each other's wounds. Mr. Anderson, she addressed Tyler, her voice gentler than before, I believe it's time we discuss your sentence. But first, I want you to really look at your father. Not the man you thought he was, the man he actually is. Tyler lifted his eyes to meet his father's, and for the first time in 15 years, they truly saw each other. The judge picked up her gavel, but what she said next would change both their lives forever. Judge Richardson set down her gavel without striking it, her eyes moving between father and son. The photograph in Tyler's trembling hands told her everything she needed to know about crafting the right sentence. Tyler Anderson, she began, her voice carrying both authority and compassion. This court has seen countless young people who believe money equals power, but today we've witnessed something far more complex. A father's love twisted into enabling and a son's pain masked by arrogance. She paused, studying Tyler's face. The smirk that had entered her courtroom was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. Your reckless driving endangered dozens of lives on Ocean Drive. Normally, that alone would earn you 6 months in juvenile detention. She let that sink in before continuing. However, I believe there's a more fitting sentence for someone who needs to learn the value of honest work and human dignity. Tyler tensed, his knuckles white around the old photograph. For the next 6 months, you will work at Richardson Global alongside your father. Same shift, same duties, same uniform. You'll learn what it really takes to earn the life you've taken for granted. Every penny you've spent, every privilege you've abused, you're going to understand the true cost. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. James Anderson's eyes widened. Furthermore, the judge continued, you'll surrender your phone, your credit cards, and yes, that expensive watch on your wrist. The only things you'll keep are the clothes on your back and that photograph in your hands. Perhaps it will remind you of where this story really began. She leaned forward, her voice softening slightly. And each week, you and your father will attend family counseling together. It's time to break this cycle of compensation and pretense. Tyler opened his mouth to protest, but for once, no words came. Unless, Judge Richardson added, you'd prefer the juvenile detention center? The silence in the courtroom was absolute as everyone waited for Tyler's response. This wasn't just a sentence. It was a crossroads. In this moment, he would either choose to grow up or continue living his lie. Tyler looked at his father, really looked at him, seeing for the first time the exhaustion etched in his face, the pride beneath the shame, the love beneath the deception. His answer would change everything. Tyler Anderson looked down at the crumpled photograph in his hands one more time. The crying toddler on those apartment steps seemed to stare back at him across 15 years of lies and pretense. His fingers traced the edge of the faded image as memories flooded back. His father, always being too busy with meetings to attend his school events, yet somehow managing to leave fresh clothes on his bed every morning. The mysterious business trips that always coincided with the times Tyler had demanded expensive gifts. All those years, he'd been living in a fantasy written by his father's sweat and sacrifice. Tyler's voice cracked, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to hide it. I accept your sentence, Your Honor. James Anderson's head snapped up, surprise written across his weathered features. And Dad. Tyler turned to face his father, his designer clothes suddenly feeling like a costume he'd worn for far too long. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The words seemed to break something inside him, a dam of pride and pretense that had been building since that day on the apartment steps. Tyler Anderson, Miami's self-proclaimed golden boy, took 3 stumbling steps forward and did something that made even Judge Richardson blink back tears. He hugged his father. The embrace was awkward at first. Tyler couldn't remember the last time he'd hugged his dad, but as James's arms wrapped around him, the years of distance seemed to melt away. I didn't know, Tyler whispered, his voice muffled against his father's uniform. All this time, you were killing yourself working, and I was. Shh, James soothed, holding his son tighter. We both made mistakes, Tyler. Me more than anyone. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just teaching you that appearances matter more than truth. Judge Richardson watched the scene unfold, her experienced eyes seeing the first real steps toward healing. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. Mr. Anderson, Tyler, your sentence begins tomorrow at 4 a.m. sharp. I trust you'll be ready? Tyler pulled back from his father's embrace, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his expensive shirt. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he stood straight, not with arrogance, but with purpose. Yes, Your Honor. He glanced at his father, managing a shaky smile. I'll be ready to work, really work. And Dad, maybe during breaks, you can tell me about yourself? The real you, I mean. I think it's time I got to know my actual father. James nodded, tears streaming freely down his face now. I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much. Judge Richardson picked up her gavel, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Then, this court is adjourned. And Tyler? Yes, Your Honor? Sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. Remember that. As Tyler walked out of courtroom 714 beside his father, his designer clothes stripped of their power, his carefully crafted image in shambles, he felt something he hadn't experienced since he was that crying toddler in the photograph. He felt real. And for the first time in his life, that was enough.